This is a rather short article on a couple of the different concepts that are used in the context of feminist considerations about violence and gendered violence. We're going to go through a couple of them and think about how they might be applied in different cultural circumstances. So Western discourses about sexual violence and rape tend to focus on consent, and they can treat individuals who are subject to that violence as victims. And there's a lot of discourse that suggests that treating people as victims can have some kind of dangerous consequences. Quote, Eastern conceptions of sexual violence sometimes read sexual violence and rape in terms of an honor crime. So both of these approaches appear to be quite distinct, the consent view and then the honor crime view. We want to ask, to what extent are they distinct, and to what extent do they either provide insights into the phenomenon of sexual violence or the phenomenological experience of being sexually violated. Which words we use to describe sexual violence, especially in an international context, against women and children, can make a great difference in how that phenomenon is statistically tabulated and how it's perceived and judged and experienced in those different societies. So the concept of consent has a long history in liberal traditions. If you've taken any course in political theory at UCSD, you will see that consent and contracts and so on are very important to the history of Western political thought. Contracts are the grounds for justifiable behavior. They're used to consider what is fair or just or owed to one another. The idea that contracts are the idea is that contracts are agreed to by free and equal persons. There will always be the concern and the worry about the kind of background conditions that are needed for contracts or agreements to be considered fair or legitimate. For example, how much bargaining advantage can someone have before it is unfair? If you follow someone like John Rawls, very famous political philosopher in the United States, in Theory of Justice, he argues that there should be no bargaining advantage whatsoever. Others have disagreed on this view. So David Hume, for example, has a different view than this. By using consent in the context of sexual violence, feminists can avail themselves of a long-standing legal framework to bear upon ending sexual violence. The underlying idea is that we own our bodies and then can contract with others to use them freely. We hear this pretty commonly in a lot of feminist refrains. So if you went to the Women's March, a lot of times you'll hear people say, keep your laws off my body, my choice, so on and so forth. But Alcoff wonders if this is the right way to think about it, or if it exhausts the way that we should think about what happens when we engage in sex or use our bodies. Do we really make a choice beforehand, and like consent, is it really best modeled as a contract? And then whatever will happen happens, come what may. She has a nice description of this on, I think, 128. So a phenomenologically apt description of sexuality under its best conditions would reveal not a desire laying complete before the act, but one that's evoked and made manifest in the act itself. In other words, my sexuality emerges in intersubjective interaction, that is, interaction with my partner or partners, and my intentionality must be understood as both embodied and as having a temporal modality. So it's embodied, it's understood through my body, I communicated through my body, and it has a modality through time. I know what I want to do fully and with certainty only in the very moment I do it. Moreover, the actions and sensations of the body itself, are coterminous with and thus constitutive of the self, rather than something the self experiences from a distance. This is precisely why rape is so damaging, as Anne Cahill has argued. It is not something separate from myself that has been stolen from me and then used against my will, as a contract model might assume. It's not like someone has taken my car and driven it away and then returned it. But it's a piece of myself which has been transformed and will remain so for the rest of my life, though I may revise it to some degree. Cahill argues the intersubjectivity of embodiment allows us to understand that the embodied self is significantly affected, even constructed, in relation to others and to the actions of others. Rape then needs to be understood as an event that alters subjectivity or selfhood. Some rape victims are all but lifeless during the violation, but others are forced to perform acts, to play as if they liked it, and some are even made to feel sexual arousal simply through the mechanics of genital stimulation. These acts are no less a violation, but can be even more troubling to the survivor, as she tries later to incorporate the part of herself that was elicited in the experience into a coherent narrative of identity. A contract approach falsely characterizes the metaphysics of the self by assuming that I have a bounded and formed self-making decisions that range over later temporal moments. It assumes I am freely exchanging that which I have kind of instrumental control over, that which I can just turn on or off. But the metaphysical assumptions underlying consent are at the basis of much feminist legal and political theory in the United States. Feminists have argued that having control over this part of ourselves, how, when, and with whom we express our sexuality, is at the base of all our beliefs about personal rights, individual autonomy, and bodily integrity. They have said that women have the right to choose, that we should have control over our own bodies, that we should be able to do whatever we want as long as it's between consenting adults. As we can see in this passage, rape is not just a violation of consent. It alters subjectivity or selfhood. One struggles with how to incorporate the event into one's life. The contract approach fails to account for the embodiment of sexual violence. It fails to account for how one might come to understand some encounter later after the fact. Furthermore, it makes it difficult to account for prosecution for rape of prostitutes and wives. So many people have a hard time understanding how a sex worker has not consented for the other to use their body. Sometimes rape happens after consensual sex has begun. Sometimes the woman continues uncomfortably, but only names the experience later. If one has done too much to signal consent, then the victim might be blamed for the event itself. Some might argue or see that contractually engaging in marriage then opens one up to being a sexual object for the other. This consent model has further problems in the cases of child abuse. So the consent model seems to imply that child abuse can be justified on these terms. Some sexual libertarians argue this. Children themselves might elicit or appear to elicit the activity. Those who retreat to a statutory conception of child abuse instead of the kind of consent model, they actually say that violation is due to the status of the child being a child. It's a matter of what kind of thing a child is, not what kind of consent the child is given, as opposed to the child providing consent or not. Some might argue that part of being a child is that you just can't give consent for things. But I think Alcoff pushes against this because we ask for children's consent all the time. So the question is, are they just the kind of thing that can't give consent in this case, perhaps? But she doesn't really consider this in that context. She does push back that says, look, this sounds a bit like paternalism, and that runs contrary to the contract doctrine's emphasis on autonomy, consent, and contracts. Ultimately, she argues, consent is just irrelevant in this context for judging the wrongness of the act of child abuse. And that's something that the contract model, the consent model, fails to account for. Now, she's not saying that consent doesn't matter. She's just pushing back on the idea that we should think of things only in terms of consent, or think of consent as exhausting all of the conceptual tools that we need to account for a particular phenomenon. So moving on to the conception of honor, she does note that honor can often be misused as a means of maintaining the material structures of social power and social dominance, just as the ideas in the West of passion and temporary insanity, trans panic, homophobic panic, etc., or gay panic, I guess it was called, those things as well can be a means of maintaining the material structures of social power and social dominance over trans people, women, and gay folk. But we can look a little deeper and see that there's a communitarian status-based model that undergirds this idea of honor. This is a very different model than the contractualist approach. On the communitarian view, we have intersubjective obligations. We have obligations of care to others. We have to relate to others in a particular way. We have responsibilities for others. So these certain obligations to others are given what kinds of things we and they are. Sexual acts and relations themselves partly constitute personhood and one's relations in a community. So on the communitarian view, violation doesn't violate just the victim. Crimes against individual women are always and also crimes against the others they are in relations with. So their families, their children, their communities. This is not just an individualistic, atomistic view. Honor crime itself might err in its de-emphasis on the detrimental effects on the individual victim. That's a common criticism that Western societies gives to honor crime discourse. But it's not an error to hold that there are effects on others. So honor crime conceptions are right to say that there is something that affects others than those who are the immediate subjects of sexual violence. It might also be wrong in what those effects are, but there is no doubt that a stigma and shame attached to a publicly disclosed humiliation of any sort. If we only look at rapes of women as women as pawns in a communal conflict, which is a common criticism of the case of the use of sexual violence by different communities, sometimes as an act of war, we risk losing sight of how rape always has a communal effect, even if it does not always have community-directed motivations. So there's something very real about trans communities, for example, complaining about rape and violence and murder in their community. There is something to be said that violence against that trans woman affects all people in the trans community. It is a signal or a display of the lack of value for trans lives, or so on and so forth. Status on these models is important, and rape is often used as a way to, quote, season girls for prostitution and to transform rebellious wives into compliant ones. It's used to confer bad status on women or to mark women as tainted. And this is the worry of, a worry of rape in these contexts. On a contractual account, we ignore the phenomenological description that rape can change oneself. It instead argues that the personhood of the woman cannot be altered or morally compromised by an act done to her without her consent. And that might be true to some extent, but it's only a half-truth. It doesn't take into account the very feelings that individuals have when they are the subjects of this kind of violence. So if we use the concept of consent in certain communities, that might actually be to the detriment of those whom we are trying to protect. So in a study in northern India, daughters who refused arranged marriages are said to bring dishonor to their family and their communities, especially if they're engaging in marriage or across caste or religious lines. But to bring these charges against their daughters, family and courts emphasized that the daughter was incapable of consent in eloping with these other people. So the law here turns on consent, but consent in this case is a highly unreliable thing given its susceptibility to abuse. So parents, for example, might talk about their daughter's emotional or hormonal imbalance that made it incapable for them to consent to this marriage. Or they'll alter the birth certificate of their child to make them look younger than they are. Consent in these cases is thus easy to disprove. The consent of the daughter marrying someone else or the woman marrying someone else, the consent there can be disproven fairly easily in this context, the context of the legal system. But in cases of rape, then, consent is commonly used to cast women as consenting partners and then to dismiss charges against rapists. So the choice of woman is intrinsically illicit when it's against community norms or parental diktat, either way. So it's against, so women's consent is impossible if they're acting in ways that are contrary to some demands by their family or the community. Consent is always present or frequently present when the behavior or the assault or the violence or the act that is under question is a challenge to male dominance. All of this shows that there are issues with applying the concept of consent cross-culturally. It will have different significance in different cultural contexts. That's the major point she's trying to give. Despite differences between the contract and communitarian approaches, there are some universals. So there's an existence of extra individual effects of these acts, the effect of violence on the subjectivity of the victim, and the paucity of prior consent as a sufficient criterion for identifying when a crime has been committed. Consent and honor have been used to mitigate punishment for sexual violence. I think an important element here is this universal that she points out on 133. Discursive traditions, whether honor or consent, are made use of for protecting the perpetrators. Relying on these same traditions to construct anti-rape policies may well be inadequate for reducing those crimes. In general, the problem with consent is when it is taken to be the defining criterion for determining whether sexual assault has occurred. It is neither sufficient nor arguably necessary in all kinds of cases, and it is phenomenologically misleading when applied to sexuality. Societies that focus less on consent than others are not necessarily wrong for that reason, though their discourses may have other, independent problems. So people in the West that criticize those perceptions or feminist movements in the East on the grounds that they're not appropriately taking into account women's consent or children's consent, well, they might not be wrong for that reason, but they might be wrong for other reasons. The last comments we'll have are on the language of victimhood. So the emphasis on victimhood intersects with some existing gender ideologies of women as weak-minded and vulnerable. This goes so far as to generate diagnoses of victim personality disorders that serve to blame victims for having psychological pathologies which invite abuse. Anti-trafficking campaigns can have a detrimental effect on workers and increase discrimination as they perpetuate stereotypes of, in this case, Asian workers as passive and diseased. This promotes further vulnerability in the eyes of those who exploit them. The reluctance to identify victims can lead to underreporting of sexual assault. So, those who are subject to sexual assault might want to avoid the appearance of being a victim. Individuals and groups in the United States who claim victimization are routinely criticized or accused of political opportunism, of self-pity, and the refusal to take personal responsibility. This can be even more exacerbated for men who are victims of sexual assault. In more communitarianist societies, victimization not only hurts the individual, but also the community. So insofar as participation in the community resides in not being a victim, one might resist that ascription for fear of some kind of ostracization or bringing on dishonor or a lower status for the community. Victimhood also obscures the experience of being a survivor. It doesn't account for one's phenomenological experience or sense of self. And sometimes narrow conceptions of victim, which demand being subject to some physical force, that might compel one not to see their situation as one of rape. This is not to say that we shouldn't be wary of some of these considerations, because some of our worries about being labeled a victim might be motivated by wrong reasons or influenced by our culture in ways that are not appropriate. But the upshot here is that our ideas of consent and honor and victimhood should be made somewhat weird to us so that we can better appreciate why the application of those concepts don't always travel particularly well or don't do the work we want them to. Each has some kind of serious shortcoming. Each has some insights worth investigating. We certainly shouldn't reject these different approaches. Certainly we shouldn't reject these different approaches outright. So this is a bit of a taste of the variety of problems that can arise if we are interested in violence against marginalized communities. What kind of language we use to account for that. And to think about some of this victimhood stuff a little bit more, It's worth looking at the Philosophy Tube video that I put up on the supplemental material section, where you can see kind of diagnosis of different ways of thinking about criminalizing sex work or decriminalizing sex work or legalizing sex work, and the language, how the language of sexual trafficking can be used to further marginalize those who are already vulnerable.